In the summer of 1941, British fighter pilots began returning from missions over occupied France with disturbing reports. They had encountered a German aircraft they didn't recognise. It wasn't a Messerschmitt. It had a radial engine, a wide stance, a short, aggressive fuselage. It was faster than their Spitfires. It accelerated harder. It rolled with astonishing speed. And when British pilots tried to follow it into a dive, it simply pulled away. For the British pilots who encountered it, the problem was simple. They could see it. They could shoot at it. But they couldn't catch it. RAF pilots were discovering that Germany had quietly produced a fighter that could outperform the frontline Spitfire Mk V in several crucial areas. Its name was the Focke-Wulf Fw 190, and for months the RAF had no reliable answer. So how had Germany built an aircraft capable of turning the RAF's greatest fighter into the underdog? And why had almost nobody seen it coming? This is the story of the Focke-Wulf Fw 190, the German fighter that shocked Britain and forced the Spitfire to evolve. But to understand why the Fw 190 shocked Britain, we have to go back to where the aircraft began. During the late 1930s, the Luftwaffe already possessed one of the finest fighters in the world, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Fast, light, powerful, and continuously improving, the Bf 109 would become the backbone of Germany's fighter force. But relying almost entirely on one design was dangerous. Engines failed, factories could be bombed, technology changed, and an enemy could eventually develop something better. Germany needed a second fighter, not because the Bf 109 had failed, but because one successful design could not carry an entire air force forever. Not necessarily a replacement for the Bf 109, but something that could fight beside it. The job went to Focke-Wulf, and one man would shape the aircraft more than anyone else. Kurt Tank. And Tank had no intention of simply building another Bf 109. He had a different philosophy. Many high-performance fighters of the 1930s were almost like racing machines, fast and elegant, but sometimes demanding to operate and maintain. Tank wanted a fighter that could survive the realities of war. It had to operate from rough airfields, withstand hard landings, remain controllable at high speed, and be easy for ground crews to maintain. The pilot needed a cockpit built for combat, not simply for flying. He wanted a machine soldiers could actually use. Then came one of the most important decisions in the entire project: the engine. Most European high-performance fighters were moving toward liquid-cooled inline engines. But Focke-Wulf chose something that seemed, at first, almost backwards: a radial engine. That decision immediately made the new fighter look different. Radial engines were wider. Their cylinders were arranged around the crankshaft, producing the large circular nose more commonly associated with aircraft like bombers and naval fighters. To some observers, putting one into Germany's newest high-performance fighter seemed like a compromise. So why choose it? Tank saw advantages. A radial engine could be extremely rugged. It didn't depend on a vulnerable liquid cooling system, and importantly for Germany, it avoided competing directly with the Bf 109 for the same type of engine. But making the idea work would not be easy, because Tank had solved one problem by choosing a radial engine and created another. Somehow, Focke-Wulf had to make that broad, air-cooled engine behave like the heart of a world-class fighter. The engine that eventually transformed the aircraft was the BMW 801, a powerful 14-cylinder radial producing roughly 1,600 horsepower in early versions. But before it could transform the Fw 190, it nearly helped destroy the project. The engine produced enormous power and enormous heat. Early prototypes overheated, and repeated engine failures threatened the entire project. Inside the cockpit, temperatures could become brutally high. The cooling was redesigned, the installation refined, and slowly the aircraft began revealing what it could really do. It was fast, very fast. But speed alone wasn't what impressed pilots. The FW-190 responded to control inputs with remarkable precision. But its most impressive quality was its roll rate. A pilot could throw the aircraft from one bank to another astonishingly quickly. In a dogfight, that could be decisive. Turning ability gets most of the attention when people compare fighters. But combat wasn't always about flying the smallest circle. Imagine a British pilot diving toward an FFW-190. He lines up his gun sight. He's almost ready to fire. Then the German pilot rolls sharply and changes direction. The British pilot has to follow. But if his aircraft rolls more slowly, the Focke-Wulf gains precious seconds. Seconds create distance. Distance ruins the firing solution. And suddenly, the hunter has lost his target. The FW-190 didn't always need to outturn an enemy. It could simply change the direction of the fight faster. Tank's philosophy extended even to the landing gear. The wide-track undercarriage made the FW-190 far more stable on rough frontline airfields. The same thinking appeared inside the cockpit. To reduce the pilot's workload, German engineers introduced systems that automatically controlled several engine functions. The pilot needed to fight the enemy, not fight his own aircraft. The deeper British engineers eventually looked inside, the more impressed they became. But in 1941, Britain knew almost none of this. And then there was the firepower. Even early FW-190 aircraft carried a formidable mix of machine guns and cannon. And in a fight decided by seconds, firepower mattered. A fighter might have only a fraction of a second to fire as an enemy crossed its gun sight. The more destructive that burst, the better. Cannons could tear into wings, engines, and cockpits with only a few hits. The FW-190 wasn't simply designed to get onto an enemy's tail. It was designed to destroy him when it got there. By 1941, the pieces were finally coming together. The overheating problems had not magically vanished, and early aircraft still suffered technical difficulties. But the fighter was ready to enter frontline service. And Germany made a clever decision. It didn't immediately send the aircraft everywhere. Instead, the FW-190 began appearing with JG-26, operating from occupied France. Directly across the English Channel, directly opposite the Royal Air Force. That placed Germany's secret fighter exactly where it could cause the most trouble. The timing was perfect. After surviving the Battle of Britain, the RAF had gone on the offensive, crossing the Channel to pressure the Luftwaffe and force its fighters into combat over occupied Europe. The Spitfire Mk V played a major role in these operations. When it entered service, it had represented an important improvement over earlier Spitfires. The Spitfire had already built a legendary reputation. Its elegant elliptical wings had become a symbol of Britain's survival. And now British pilots were taking that symbol back across the Channel. They expected opposition. They expected Bf-109s. They knew how to fight those. Then, in the summer of 1941, something unfamiliar began appearing. From a distance, the Radial-Engine fighter didn't resemble the Messerschmitt they knew so well. Reports began filtering back. A new German fighter, extremely fast, highly maneuverable, powerful, but every encounter added another piece to the puzzle. The new German fighter wasn't simply different. In several important areas, it was better. The Spitfire could still turn beautifully. In the right circumstances, it remained lethal. But the FW-190 didn't need to fight the Spitfire's fight. It could roll faster, accelerate aggressively, dive away. And at many of the altitudes where combat was taking place, it possessed a speed advantage over the Spitfire Mk V. That gave German pilots something priceless: choice. If the situation favoured them, they could attack. If it didn't, they could often leave. And over occupied France, that advantage became even more dangerous. German pilots were often fighting close to their own bases, supported by their own radar and ground control network. British pilots had crossed the Channel into enemy territory. They had limited fuel, and eventually they had to turn for home. The Fw-190 therefore entered combat with more than a performance advantage. It was appearing in an environment where German pilots could exploit that performance on favourable terms. The RAF wasn't simply fighting a better performing aircraft. It was fighting that aircraft over territory where the Luftwaffe held important tactical advantages. By August 1941, the Fw-190 had begun its frontline career over France. The Luftwaffe had changed the rules. The legendary Spitfire had met an opponent it could no longer reliably catch, and Britain now faced an even bigger problem. The RAF knew the Fw-190 was dangerous, but it still didn't know exactly what this new fighter was capable of. By early 1942, the RAF needed answers. British intelligence gathered every report it could find. Pilots were questioned after encounters. Performance estimates were compared. Combat tactics were studied. But there was a limit to what could be learned from watching an aircraft disappear into the distance. Britain needed an intact Fw-190. Not wreckage, not photographs, not another pilot's description. A complete aircraft. One British test pilots could actually fly. Only then could engineers determine exactly what Germany had built. The problem was getting one. The Luftwaffe wasn't going to hand one over, and a badly damaged wreck couldn't reveal what the machine could really do. Britain grew so desperate, it even explored a commando raid across the Channel to seize an Fw-190 from a German airfield. The fact that such an operation was considered at all showed how badly the RAF wanted to understand its new enemy. But before Britain had to take that gamble, Germany accidentally delivered exactly what it wanted. The story began on June 23, 1942. German fighter pilot Mk V was flying an Fw-190A3 during combat over the southwest of England. The fighting became confused. Aircraft scattered. Eventually, Faber believed he had found his route home. Below him appeared water, then coastline, and finally an airfield. To Faber, it appeared to be safety. He descended, lowered his landing gear, and prepared to land. Nothing about the airfield seemed unusual until it was too late. The wheels touched down. The Fw-190 slowed. Then Faber saw the men running toward his aircraft. He wasn't in France. He was at RAF Pembrey in Wales. For months, the RAF had desperately wanted an intact example of Germany's mysterious new fighter. Now one was sitting on a British airfield, undamaged. Its weapons were present. Its instruments were intact. Britain didn't have to steal the Fw-190. A German pilot had flown one directly to them. Faber was taken prisoner. His aircraft became one of the most valuable pieces of intelligence Britain had obtained. And almost immediately, the examination began. For RAF engineers and test pilots, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The captured fighter could be measured, taken apart, inspected, and most importantly, flown. Now Britain could stop guessing. How fast was it really? How quickly could it climb? How rapidly could it roll? How did it compare directly with the Spitfire? The answers weren't comforting. British test pilots were now able to experience the aircraft from the inside, and some of the qualities RAF pilots had described in combat suddenly made sense. The controls felt precise. Visibility from the cockpit was good. The engine responded quickly, but the roll rate stood out immediately. This was no longer an intelligence estimate based on a frightened pilot's report After combat, British pilots could now put the German fighter through controlled maneuvers, then compare what they had felt directly with aircraft of their own. And that mattered, because combat reports could be misleading. A pilot who had been surprised from above might believe the enemy was faster than it really was. A fighter escaping in a dive could appear almost untouchable. Fear, altitude, position and fuel could all distort what happened in the sky. But now the RAF had something far more valuable than impressions. It had evidence. At lower and medium altitudes, the Fw-190A possessed serious advantages over the Spitfire Mk V. Its roll performance was particularly impressive. Its acceleration and diving characteristics gave it tactical options the Spitfire struggled to match. The Spitfire still had strengths. It could outturn the Fw-190 in a sustained turning fight. At certain altitudes and under certain circumstances, a skilled RAF pilot could absolutely defeat one. The Focke-Wulf wasn't invincible. But that wasn't the point. The RAF didn't need proof that a Spitfire could shoot one down. It needed a fighter that could meet the Fw-190 without beginning the engagement at a disadvantage. And the Spitfire Mk V was no longer enough. Fortunately for Britain, another development was already underway. At Rolls-Royce, engineers had been transforming the Merlin engine. The answer wasn't simply more horsepower. The real breakthrough was maintaining power higher into the sky. The new Merlin 61 used a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. That gave the engine dramatically improved performance at altitude. Put that engine into a Spitfire, and suddenly the equation could change. There was just one problem. The Spitfire version, originally intended to take full advantage of this new generation of engines, wasn't ready in the numbers Britain urgently needed. The Fw-190 was already fighting. British pilots were already dying. The RAF couldn't wait. So Supermarine took an existing airframe, installed the new engine. The result was supposed to be temporary, an emergency answer to an enemy Britain hadn't expected, the Spitfire Mk IX. Nobody could know it yet, but this rushed response would become one of the most important Spitfire variants of the entire war. By the summer of 1942, the first Mk IXs began reaching operational units. For almost a year, the Fw-190 had enjoyed a period in which it could often dictate the terms of combat against Britain's frontline Spitfire. Now RAF pilots were finally receiving something capable of challenging it much more evenly. Britain had found its answer. But the battle between these two fighters was only beginning, because while British engineers were studying the captured Fw-190 and pushing the Spitfire to new levels of performance, Germany was discovering something equally important. The Focke-Wulf could do far more than shoot down Spitfires. The aircraft that had shocked Britain was about to become one of Germany's most adaptable weapons. And eventually, the Luftwaffe would ask it to confront an enemy far more difficult than the Spitfire. Thousands of American bombers coming directly for Germany. The first transformation was already underway. Germany discovered that the FFW-190's rugged construction and powerful engine made it exceptionally useful as a fighter bomber. Bomb racks appeared beneath the aircraft. Instead of waiting for RAF fighters over France, Fw-190 aircraft could cross the English Channel at extremely low altitude, sometimes barely above the waves. British radar had much less time to detect them. The aircraft approached fast, hit coastal targets, then turned for home before RAF fighters could respond effectively. These raids weren't strategically decisive, but they were enormously frustrating. Britain had spent years preparing to intercept large formations of German bombers. Now small numbers of fast Fw-190 aircraft could appear suddenly, release their bombs, and disappear. Then the Fw-190 went east. On the Eastern Front, it met a completely different war, Primitive airfields, enormous distances, brutal weather, and a mission that could mean attacking anything from Soviet fighters to tanks and troop columns. The very qualities Kurt Tank had insisted on, the rugged construction, the wide landing gear, the heavy armament, suddenly became invaluable in perhaps the harshest conditions imaginable. Ground attack versions became increasingly important. Some received additional armour to protect the pilot and engine from ground fire. It was becoming something the Luftwaffe desperately needed. Not simply an air superiority fighter, but a multi-role combat aircraft. And that versatility would become even more important when Germany's strategic position began to collapse. Because by 1943, a new threat was appearing over Europe. Not dozens of bombers, hundreds. American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators began penetrating deeper into German-controlled Europe. Their objective was fundamentally different from the RAF's nighttime bombing campaign. The Americans attacked in daylight, aircraft factories, oil facilities, rail yards, industrial centres, targets essential to Germany's ability to continue fighting, and they came in enormous formations. A single heavy bomber carried multiple defensive machine guns. Hundreds flying together created overlapping fields of fire. To reach them, German fighter pilots had to fly directly into a storm of bullets. Imagine the problem from the cockpit of an Fw-190. Ahead of you is not a single bomber. It's a formation stretching across the sky. Each aircraft is protected by guns, and those guns overlap with the aircraft flying beside it. To make your own weapons effective, you have to close the distance. Every second you get closer makes your cannon more dangerous. But it also makes you an easier target. And even if you survive the first attack, you have only seconds to fire before you race through the formation and have to break away. This was a completely different problem from fighting a Spitfire over the Channel. Against a fighter, manoeuvrability could keep you alive. Against a bomber formation, Germany needed something else. Enough firepower to cause catastrophic damage in a very short firing window. The Luftwaffe needed firepower, lots of it. Once again, the Fw-190 was adapted. Additional cannon could be fitted. Some bomber interceptor versions received extra armour. The objective was straightforward. Get close enough to a B-17. Fire as much destructive ammunition as possible. Break away. Then attack again. Against heavy bombers, rifle-caliber machine guns were increasingly inadequate. A B-17 could absorb enormous punishment and continue flying. 20mm cannon shells were far more effective, and the Fw-190 could carry several cannon without needing an entirely new aircraft. This was exactly the adaptability that made the design so valuable. But that adaptability came with a problem. Every new role demanded something more from the aircraft, and every addition came at a cost. More guns, more armour, more ammunition, all of it added weight. And weight was the enemy of fighter performance. A heavily armed Fw-190 designed to destroy bombers wasn't necessarily the same agile aircraft British pilots had first encountered in 1941. It accelerated more slowly. Climbing became harder. Manoeuvrability suffered. Germany was being forced into a compromise. Make the fighter heavy enough to destroy American bombers. And it became more vulnerable to the fighters protecting them. At first, that problem was manageable. American escort fighters didn't always have the range to accompany bombers all the way into Germany. Luftwaffe pilots could wait until the escorts turned home, then attack. But that advantage didn't last. By late 1943 and early 1944, long-range American fighters began appearing deeper over Germany. Most importantly, the P-51 Mustang. Suddenly, German pilots couldn't simply wait for the escorts to disappear. Mustangs remained with the bombers far beyond the range Germany had once considered possible. Now heavily armed Fw-190 fighters had to fight their way through escort fighters before they could even reach the bombers. The Luftwaffe was being squeezed from both directions, too lightly armed. And the Fw-190 struggled to destroy a heavy bomber quickly, too heavily armed. And it became easier prey for the escorts. There was no perfect answer. Yet the Fw-190 remained dangerous. In the hands of experienced pilots, it could still punish any opponent who underestimated it. But the circumstances that had allowed it to dominate the Spitfire Mk V in 1941 were gone. The Allies had adapted, and they were producing new fighters in enormous numbers. Germany couldn't simply improve the existing Fw-190 forever. There was another problem, one that had been present from the beginning: altitude. The BMW 801 Radial-Engine was excellent at low and medium altitudes, but as altitude increased, its performance deteriorated. American bombers frequently operated at altitudes where early FFW-190 variants were no longer at their best. Allied fighters were improving at those heights too. Germany needed the Focke-Wulf speed, firepower and handling, but it needed them higher in the sky. Kurt Tank knew it, so did the Luftwaffe. Experiments began. Different engines, different supercharging arrangements, modified airframes. Some versions attempted to push the Radial-Engine fighter higher, but the most important solution would dramatically change the appearance of the aircraft. To keep the Fw-190 competitive, Tank was about to sacrifice the feature that had defined its silhouette from the beginning: the Radial-Engine. In its place came the Junkers Jumo 213, a liquid-cooled inverted V12. Installing it transformed the Fw-190's familiar shape. The short, blunt radial nose disappeared. In its place came a long engine cowling. The fuselage was extended. The tail was modified to maintain balance. To anyone familiar with the original fighter, the new aircraft looked almost wrong. This was still an Fw-190, but barely. The new version became the Fw-190D, the Dora, and initially, not everyone wanted it. Some German pilots had grown deeply attached to the radial-engined Fw-190. They knew the aircraft's behaviour. The long-nosed Dora looked unfamiliar. Some feared it was merely a temporary compromise until more advanced fighters arrived. Then pilots began flying it, and opinions changed. The Jumo 213 gave the Fw-190D substantially better performance at altitude while preserving much of what pilots already liked about the original design. It was fast, responsive. At lower and medium altitudes, earlier Fw-190 fighters had shocked the RAF. Now the Dora extended the design's usefulness into a part of the sky where Germany increasingly needed it. But there was an uncomfortable reality. Germany was producing better fighters, while losing the ability to use them effectively. Fuel shortages became severe. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Training hours for new pilots were reduced. Allied aircraft appeared over Germany in overwhelming numbers. An excellent fighter flown by an inexperienced pilot against several well-trained opponents remained in enormous danger. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe wasn't fighting for superiority over Europe anymore. It was fighting for survival. And the Fw-190 was being asked to do almost everything: intercept bombers, support ground troops, defend airfields, even protect Germany's revolutionary new jet fighters during their most vulnerable moments. The aircraft that had begun as an alternative to the Bf-109 had become one of the Luftwaffe's most important machines. And still, Kurt Tank wasn't satisfied. The Dora had solved part of the altitude problem, but he believed the basic design could be pushed even further: higher, faster, more powerful. That effort eventually produced the TA-152. The TA-152 looked like an Fw-190, stretched almost beyond recognition, a specialized high-altitude fighter built around a powerful engine and a dramatically altered airframe. On paper, it was one of Germany's most formidable piston-engine aircraft. But it arrived far too late. Only small numbers became operational before the war ended. By then, Germany no longer needed a slightly better fighter. It needed time, fuel, pilots, factories, and none of those could be manufactured quickly enough. That is what makes the Fw-190 story so remarkable. When British pilots first encountered it in 1941, Germany had temporarily jumped ahead. The RAF responded with better Spitfires. Germany responded with better Focke-Wulfs. The Americans arrived with long-range escorts. Germany added armour and firepower. The bombers flew higher. Germany developed the Dora. Every advantage produced a response. Every response created another problem. The air war had become an engineering race measured in months, sometimes weeks. And no fighter could remain superior forever. By 1945, the Fw-190 was no longer the mysterious aircraft British pilots had once struggled even to identify. The Allies knew it intimately. They knew its strengths, they knew its weaknesses, and they had developed aircraft specifically capable of challenging it. Yet thousands of Fw-190s were still fighting, from France to Russia, from the Arctic to the defence of Germany itself. But by the final year of the war, the question was no longer whether the Fw-190 could beat a Spitfire. The question was whether even one of Germany's finest fighters could survive against an enemy that now seemed to own the sky. Germany was surrounded. Allied fighters filled the skies. Fuel was disappearing, and veteran pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. By then, even the FFW-190 could no longer change the outcome. But that doesn't mean the FFW-190 had failed, because its greatest impact had already happened. It had forced the Allies to respond. By the final months of the war, FW-190s were being used in increasingly desperate circumstances. Some defended airfields used by Germany's new Me-262 jet fighters, protecting the jets during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. The irony was difficult to miss. The FW-190 had once represented the frightening future of fighter aviation. Now it was protecting the aircraft that represented the next generation. The piston engine fighter was approaching its technological limit. The jet age had begun. And Germany was running out of time. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the career of the FW-190 had lasted less than 4 years in frontline combat. Yet in that short period, it had become one of the defining fighters of the war. Roughly 20,000 FW-190s and derivatives were built. They fought from the English Channel to the Eastern Front, from North Africa to the defence of Germany itself. It never replaced the Bf-109 completely. It didn't need to. Together, the two aircraft became the backbone of Germany's fighter force. But the FW-190 brought something different: ruggedness, versatility, heavy firepower, and when it first appeared, a genuine technological shock. That brings us back to those British pilots in 1941. Imagine it. You're flying a Spitfire, one of the finest fighters on Earth. You cross the Channel expecting Messerschmitts. Then an unfamiliar aircraft appears. You turn after it. It rolls away faster. You dive. It pulls ahead. You try to catch it. You can't. And if its pilot gets his guns onto you, the firepower is devastating. That was the Focke-Wulf shock. But perhaps the most important part of the story is what happened next. Britain didn't accept the disadvantage. The Focke-Wulf Fw-190 forced Britain to adapt, and Britain did. And that may be the real legacy of the Focke-Wulf Fw 190. It wasn't unbeatable. No fighter was. It didn't win the air war for Germany. No single aircraft could have. But when it appeared over France in 1941, it changed the tactical balance almost overnight. British pilots suddenly discovered that reputation meant nothing at 20,000 feet. Yesterday's best fighter could become tomorrow's underdog. The Focke-Wulf Fw 190 didn't prove that the Spitfire was a failure. It did something far more remarkable. It forced one of the greatest fighters in history to become even better. So here's the question. It's 1942 and you have to fly one combat mission over Europe. Spitfire, Mark 9 or Fw 190, which one are you taking and why? Tell me below, and if you want more stories about the machines that shaped the air war, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.